What constant overstimulation is doing to your attention. Try to read something for 10 minutes without checking your phone. Not a quick article, something longer. A chapter of a book, a long essay, a report you've been meaning to get through. Just 10 minutes. No notifications, no switching, no quick checks. For a lot of people, that's genuinely difficult now. Not because they're not intelligent. Not because the material isn't interesting. But because somewhere in the middle, the mind drifts. To the phone. To a notification. To the vague sense that something might have happened somewhere that you should know about. The pull arrives before you've even consciously noticed you're bored. This is new. Or at least it's newer than we think. And it's worth understanding why it's happening. Because the answer isn't simply that we're all distracted. It's more specific than that. And more fixable. Attention is a skill, and skills erode. Attention is not a single thing. It's a collection of related capacities, the ability to focus on one thing, to filter out irrelevant stimulation, to sustain engagement over time, to resist the pull of more immediately rewarding alternatives. Like most cognitive capacities, it isn't fixed. It isn't something you either have or don't have. All of these capacities are trainable. They develop with practice, and they erode with disuse. A person who reads deeply for an hour a day builds something different in their brain than a person who switches between 5 things every 10 minutes. Neither is making a conscious choice about their cognitive architecture. But both are shaping it through repetition, through habit, through the accumulated pattern of how they direct their attention across thousands of ordinary moments. And over the last decade or so, the conditions of modern life have been systematically training attention in the wrong direction. Every time you switch tabs because you're mildly bored, every time you pick up your phone in the middle of a conversation, every time you check for notifications during a task that doesn't require it, you're not just being distracted, you're practicing distraction. You're reinforcing the neural pathway that says, when attention becomes uncomfortable, redirect it. When the friction of staying rises above a certain threshold, leave. Do that enough times and it becomes the default. Not a choice, but an automatic response to any moment of friction. The redirect happens before you've decided to redirect. The phone is in your hand before the thought to reach for it has fully formed. The hidden cost of switching. There's a concept in neuroscience called attentional residue. When you switch from one task to another, part of your attention doesn't immediately follow. It lingers on the previous task, processing it, returning to it mentally, keeping it partially active in working memory. The switch feels complete. Cognitively, it isn't. This means that every time you interrupt a task to check something else, you're not just losing the time it takes to check. You're also degrading the quality of your attention when you return. The residue accumulates. And if you're switching tasks frequently, which most people are, far more than they realize, you're rarely operating with your full attentional capacity on anything. Research suggests it can take up to 20 minutes to fully return to deep focus after a significant interruption. Most people interrupt themselves far more often than every 20 minutes. Which means, mathematically, that many people spend very little of their working day in a state of genuine deep focus. The work gets done. But it gets done on the surface. The deeper, more original, more demanding kind of thinking, the kind that requires sustained, uninterrupted attention, quietly stops happening. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just gradually as the average depth of engagement across a day trends lower and lower, and nobody notices because the output still looks roughly the same from the outside. Why it doesn't feel like a problem. Part of what makes this so hard to address is that the interruptions don't feel like interruptions. They feel like choices. Checking your phone feels voluntary. Switching tabs feels like a decision. The pull toward novelty and stimulation is experienced as preference rather than compulsion. And because it feels like a choice, it doesn't trigger the same alarm that an external disruption might. If a colleague interrupted you every 8 minutes, you'd eventually say something. When you interrupt yourself every 8 minutes, it registers as nothing, just the normal texture of a working day. But the pull is not as voluntary as it feels. The technologies we use most are specifically designed to generate it. Variable reward schedules, the same mechanism behind slot machines, keep attention returning to feeds and inboxes because the reward is unpredictable. Sometimes there's something interesting, sometimes there isn't. And the unpredictability is precisely what makes the pull so hard to resist. A feed that was always interesting would be less compelling than one that's only sometimes interesting, because the uncertainty keeps the system active. Your attention isn't wandering because you're weak or undisciplined. It's wandering because it's being actively competed for by systems that are very good at winning that competition, systems that have been refined specifically to capture and hold attention, and that have billions of dollars of engineering behind them. That's not a fair fight, and recognizing that changes how you think about the problem. How the brain adapts and at what cost. We've moved into an environment where the volume and velocity of information is genuinely unprecedented. Not just more content, more types of content, more formats, more channels, more ways to be reached at any given moment. The cognitive demand of simply keeping up with the surface of modern life, the messages, the updates, the feeds, the headlines, is higher than it has ever been in human history. And the brain, faced with that volume, adapts. Not by becoming better at processing everything, but by becoming better at processing quickly and shallowly. Faster pattern recognition, faster filtering, faster movement between things. The brain that spends years in this environment gets genuinely good at skimming, at scanning, at extracting just enough from any given piece of content to know whether it needs more attention. These adaptations are useful for navigating information-dense environments. In many contexts, they're genuinely valuable, but they work directly against sustained attention. The brain that has learned to skim efficiently is the same brain that finds it hard to stay with one thing long enough to understand it deeply. Because deep understanding requires the very kind of sustained, slow, non-skimming engagement that the adaptation has been trained away from. Speed and depth are in tension. And for most people, without deliberate effort, speed wins by default. The friction before focus. Here's something that often surprises people when they first try to rebuild their attention. The difficulty isn't focus itself. It's the discomfort that precedes focus. In the first few minutes of sustained attention on a single task, there's almost always a period of restlessness. The mind looks for an exit. It generates the urge to check something, to switch, to briefly do something else and come back. This phase is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to describe, a kind of low-grade friction like holding still when every impulse says to move. It doesn't feel like anything is wrong. It just feels like the situation could be slightly improved by doing something else for a moment. Most people interpret this friction as a signal, a sign that they can't focus, or that the task isn't right, or that they need a break. But it's actually a normal and predictable part of the attention process. It's the transition between scattered and settled. And if you can stay with it without acting on the urge to escape, it usually passes within a few minutes. Something closer to genuine focus becomes available on the other side. The restlessness subsides. The material draws you in. Time starts to move differently. The problem is that most people have never stayed with that friction long enough to find out what's on the other side. Because the phone is always within reach. The exit is always 1 second away. And 1 second is short enough that leaving never feels like a significant decision, even though across a day and a week and a year, those exits compound into something significant. Rebuilding attention, in practice, means learning to sit in that uncomfortable transition without leaving it. Not forever, just long enough for it to pass. 3 changes that actually help. There are a few practical changes that make a meaningful difference, not because they're revolutionary, but because they reduce the competition for your attention before it begins. The first is distance. Physical distance from your phone during any period of work you care about. Not silent, not face down. Physically in another room if possible. Research consistently shows that the mere presence of a smartphone, even switched off, even face down on a desk, reduces available cognitive capacity because part of your brain is always monitoring it, allocating a small slice of attention to the possibility that something might require a response. Distance removes the monitoring load entirely. The second is monotasking. Choosing one thing for a defined period of time and doing only that. No open tabs you're not actively using. No background noise that contains language. No half-finished tasks visible in your peripheral vision. The environment should narrow your attention, not compete with it. Every visible distraction is a small but real drain on the attentional resource you're trying to protect. The third is starting shorter than you think you need to. If sustained focus feels difficult, begin with 10 minutes, not an hour. 10 minutes of genuine single-task attention, without interruption. Then stop deliberately, not because you got bored, but because the session is complete. Then do it again tomorrow and the day after. The capacity builds with practice, but it builds slowly, and trying to force it with long sessions before the foundation is there usually just produces frustration and the conclusion that you simply can't focus. Which isn't true. What you're actually protecting. Attention is what makes everything else possible. It's the medium through which you experience your own life, your relationships, your work, your thinking, your sense of being genuinely present in any given moment rather than half somewhere else. When attention fragments, everything becomes slightly thinner. Conversations are half heard. Work is half done. Ideas form but never fully develop, because the thinking gets interrupted before it reaches the depth where the interesting parts live. Even rest doesn't fully restore, because the mind never fully lands anywhere long enough to actually be there. It keeps scanning, keeps monitoring, keeps the low-grade hum of readiness active even when nothing requires it. Reclaiming attention isn't about becoming a monk or eliminating technology from your life. It's about recognizing that attention is something you can choose to protect, and that protecting it consistently changes the quality of almost everything. The quality of your thinking, the quality of your presence with other people, the quality of your experience of your own days. The world will keep competing for it. The systems designed to capture it will keep getting better. That's not going to change. But you get to decide how much of it you give away and how much you choose to keep.